everyone to this seventh of the installment of the academic series that Campaign Lab runs, where we feature academics or folks from academia to present on their work that is relevant and pertinent to the progressive ecosystem that we're all here to support. Today, we've got Emmanuel, who will be presenting on can we predict a voting intention with brainwaves? Just a quick shout out for next week's event, next month's event, apologies. That'll be Labour's Response to Reform by Dr. Stephanie Luke. A bit more about Emmanuel, who'll be presenting today. Emmanuel did his PhD in experimental psychology and neuroscience at University College London with Dr. Lee DeVette and Joe Devlin. He researched whether swing voters present any distinct psychologically differences compared to other voters and how to predict political attitudes and behaviors with non-political measures. He currently works in data science with a focus on MRP and worked before for the Remain campaign and in the European Public Affairs. And without further ado, Emmanuel, over to you to present today. And thanks again for joining us. Just a quick announcement. We are recording this session. As usual, Emmanuel will do his presentation. We'll end off with Q&A and finish off with polls to see how everyone felt about the episode. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Thanks, Douglas. Thanks for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak at Campaign Lab today. So let me share my slides. Can you see that all right? Cool, excellent, thanks. So, political campaigns, one of the main things that they try to do is to win over undecided voters, as these often tip the election one way or the other. The challenge in that is that often the tools they have at their disposal are things like polls and surveys asking people what they think of the incumbent, what their approval of the main party leaders is, what are the top issues according to them, and how they're going to vote. And these measures are what I would call explicit political preferences, because they're explicitly held, they're conscious, and they can be expressed in polls and surveys. And the problem with that is that undecided voters typically aren't don't give always reliable answers on those explicit preferences. They tend to be people who have low political interest, low political awareness, and might not and will not, have very clear ideas on what are the top issues because they don't care about them, what they think of the main party leaders because they might not necessarily know who they are, and but the tools that are normally used by traditional campaigns, not Campaign Lab because you guys are cutting edge, are often inadequate to measure how undecided voters are going to behave. Now, explicit preferences are only the tip of the iceberg because they tend to be formed and shaped by moral values, by more deeply rooted causal factors, which I refer to as you'll have guessed, implicit preferences, which are only parts that influence, that shape the explicit preferences of voting intention and like or dislike political candidates. The implicit preference that I used in this study, which you're going to know all about by the end of the session, is event-related potentials. Now, event-related potentials are continuous measures of the brain's electrical activity. They give you a window, a peek into the unfolding cognitive processes which lead to a behavior, voting being potentially one of those behaviors. And the specific event-related potential that was my measure of implicit preference is called the N400. It's called that way because it's negative going, hence the N, and it occurs around 400 milliseconds after the stimulus onset, after you see, read, or hear something, hence the 400. And the useful thing about the N400 is that it's a very good index of whether something is incongruent with what you know. So it can be semantic incongruence. For example, if I tell you that Darth Vader is piloting a TIE fighter, that's not going to cause a big N400. It's not, so here you can see what the N400 would look like. This graph does not have anything to do with Darth Vader, but we're going to assume it does. Because you know that Darth Vader is a Sith Lord and the default starfighter of the Imperial fleet is the TIE fighter. So it makes sense that he would be piloting a TIE fighter. But if I tell you that Darth Vader is piloting a rainbow unicorn, that's going to cause a big N400 response because you're not used to seeing rainbow unicorns as a concept associated with Darth Vader. And that incongruence, that semantic incongruence, is going to lead to a higher N400 response. The interesting thing is that the N400 doesn't only denote semantic incongruence, incongruence of meaning. It can also denote incongruence with moral beliefs, with moral principles that you hold. So, for example, there is a researcher who asked strict Christians believers to read sentences and statements that they disagreed with. Here, for example, one of the statements they read was, "I think euthanasia is an acceptable course of action." And when they read acceptable, which they disagreed with as principle, these participants had a larger N400 response than when they read an acceptable course of action. And you can see that difference here in the little green oval that I traced, where the N400 effect is greater for the statements you disagree with than with those you agree with. Now, there's a researcher at Kingston University here in London called Giulia Galli that you see here framed on the slide, who had the idea of seeing if the N400 could actually pick up disagreement with one's political beliefs. In other words, if there is an incongruence between what you're reading and your personal political beliefs. And she did this before the 2016 EU referendum, where she took people who were decided to vote leave, people who were decided to vote remain, and asked them to read sentences that they agreed with or that they disagreed with. So, for example, one statement was, "If Britain leaves Europe, our quality of life will be enhanced." Whilst the pro-Remain version of that statement is, "If Britain leaves Europe, our quality of life will be reduced." And her hypothesis was that the N400 response, which indexes disagreement, would be greater for statements you disagree with. So basically, the Remain voters should have a bigger N400 response when they read that our quality of life will be enhanced by leaving the EU. And that is exactly what she found. Here you can see on the left-hand panel, on the left-hand graph, these are the average N400 responses to the statements. The pro-leave statements are those in red, whilst the pro-remain statements averaged responses are those in blue. And you can see that for Remain voters, the N400 response to pro-leave statements was greater than to pro-Remain statements they agreed with. And the reverse was true for Leave voters who had a stronger N400 response to the items they disagreed with, i.e. the Remain items. So this is fascinating because it shows you that the N400 actually can also index and reflect the explicit preferences. But then how about the voters who claim not to have preferences, undecided voters? If they don't have any implicit preference, if they don't have any preferences, then these two lines should hypothetically overlap. But that's not what happened. Here on the next slide, you have the average waveforms of undecided voters. And what it shows you is that it's actually similar to the waveforms to the N400 responses of decided Remain voters. And in fact, the vast majority of these undecided voters end up voting Remain. So Galli took this as evidence that the N400 can actually predict the way you're going to vote, that it can actually that it actually taps into embryonic implicit preferences that you might not necessarily be aware of, so you don't report in polls and surveys. The problem was that she didn't have many undecided voters who voted leave, which means that the evidence from the study weren't as conclusive. Now, I wanted to see in my study if we could replicate this methodology in a different context, in particular in the context of the United States, and if we could predict how undecided voters would vote and how the implicit measures of political preference, like the N400 and another one, compared with the explicit ones. So, so these are all the aims of my experiment. I conducted it at the University of Texas at San Antonio, which was an ideal place because it was just before the midterm elections of 2022 in Texas. There was also a gubernatorial election for the state governor of Texas. And the research was hosted in Professor Witcher's lab. You see her framed here in the top right corner, which is who's one of the leading experts on the N400. And most of my participants were first-time voters, which is really good because the older voters tend to be more settled into their voting habits and not to change as much compared to younger voters. And the experiment looked like this. You had participants sitting in an electrically isolated room and reading the political statements that were either pro-Republican or pro-Democratic, one word at a time. And the first 10 words were neutral. It's only the last word of each statement that made it pro-Democratic or pro-Republican. And the reason for that is that you measure the N400 after the word. So if you have another word after that, then your signal might get cut off by the new word, and you want to isolate the effect of the N400 after that word that activates your beliefs and the potential incongruence between the word you just read and your beliefs. So the statements themselves were fell in three main buckets. One of them was immigration, the other economy, and the last one was societal issues. And these were the issues that were most salient in that election in Texas. So, for example, a pro-Republican statement was the ownership of automatic assault weapons like AR-15s needs to be protected. Whilst the Democratic version of that one is the same, except for the final word. The ownership of automatic assault weapons like AR-15s needs to be restricted. So we basically expect for Republican participants to have a lower N400 response for protected compared to restricted. And these statements allowed me to derive two measures. One of them was an explicit preference index, which is basically all the agree-disagree responses to these statements that participants made. And it also allowed me to average the N400 responses, which is the implicit measure. So there was another implicit measure that I was interested in, which is child-rearing questions. And what these questions look like is asking you, would you say that it's more important for a child to be, for example, independent or respectful of their elders? Notice I'm sure you would say respectful of their elders, aren't you? No, I'm just kidding. And there are several pairs of these. The reason these and the attitude that these items measure is referred to in academia as authoritarianism, which I think is an incorrect term. What they fundamentally measure is how group-focused your social values are, as opposed to being individual-focused. And this measure is a really good predictor of how likely you are to swing to the far right or to vote to the far right. So, for example, it's predicted swings to UKIP, to the Rassemblement National, voting for Trump, for the AfD in Germany, and so on and so forth. Even for people who have always voted for mainstream parties, if you are high in this measure, you're much more likely to swing to the far right. So, to recap, the measures that I used in this experiment were the N400 and the child rearing questions for the implicit measures. For the measures of explicit preference, there are several, which are the traditional measures used by political campaigns and even researchers, which were this explicit preference index. These are all the agree-disagree responses, averaged to form an index that tells us how aligned you are with the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. The president's job approval, how do you perceive the economy to be doing, and so on and so forth. So, what results did we get on the N400? To remind you, the hypothesis is that for decided Democrats, the N400 response to Republican statements will be greater than that to Democratic statements, because the idea is that they disagree with it, so the N400 response is greater with the Republican statements. And that's what we found for decided Democrats. What you see here, on the left-hand side, you have the averaged N400 responses to the Republican statements, that's the little red line, and the average N400 response to the Democratic statements, which is the little blue line. And the rectangle shows you the window in which the N400 occurs. And this is what we were expecting. So here you can see that for decided Democrats, the N400 response was greater to those Republican statements, as we would have predicted. And the scalp maps on the right shows you the distribution of the effect. And this is basically where the N400 is known to occur, around central and parietal electrode sites on the scalp. And how about undecided voters who voted Democrat? If the hypothesis is correct, they should have a similar pattern to decided Democrats, even if they said they were undecided and their preferences weren't clear. Again, that's what we found. The decided Democrats had an even stronger N400 response to Republican statements compared to Democratic statements. And you can see the effect was stronger. In fact, I forgot to mention that the measure on the y-axis is microvolts, and on the x-axis you have the time in milliseconds. So for the Republicans, we expect the opposite. We basically would expect the little blue line, to speak in practical terms, we'd expect the little blue line to be above the little red line, because we'd expect this implicit measure to show us that Republicans are disagreeing more with Democratic statements, shown by the blue line, than with Republican statements, averaged in the red line. That's not what I found. What I found was that there was in fact no difference. Here you can actually see it looks similar to how decided Democrats responded, but there's actually statistically no significant difference in how they responded, which is counterintuitive and leaves us wondering, why is that? I mean, these are people who are decided Republicans whose explicit preferences indicated them to be Republicans. And how about the undecided voters who voted Republican? Again, we'd expect to see a stronger N400 response to the Democratic statements, the blue line, than to Republican statements. Again, that wasn't the case. Actually, here we had a significant difference suggesting that undecided voters who ended up voting Republican were in fact disagreeing more implicitly with Republican statements than with Democratic statements. Now, this is where N400 and implicit measures show you their added value, because when you just look at people's vote, it doesn't tell you how divided, how conflicted people might have been in picking one party, one candidate over the other. But this measure can. And in fact, we want to compare the explicit measures with the implicit measures. This plot here shows you the N400 effect. And basically, the higher up you go, the more it's a Republican-leaning N400 effect. It suggests, greater disagreement with the Democratic items. Whilst if you go further down, it shows you more Democratic-leaning N400 effects. So people disagreeing more with the Republican items than with the Democratic ones, implicitly. whilst on the x-axis, you have the explicit preferences, so all the agree-disagree, which show you how aligned people say they are with the Democratic or the Republican Party, based on their responses to all the statements. And if the N for 100 and the explicit preferences were perfectly aligned, we would basically expect all the Democrats to fall, all the people who voted Democrat, to fall in that quadrant that I just highlighted with the blue circle. And you'd expect all the Republicans to fall in that quadrant up there in the top right corner, because you would expect the Democrats to have Democratic leaning N for 100 effects and democratic and alignment with the explicit preferences of the Democratic Party, and the reverse with the Republicans. But as you can see, that's not the case. There are a lot of people in the bottom right quadrant who were aligned with the Republican Party when they said they agreed or disagreed with various statements, but actually their N for 100 is more consistent with a Democratic-leaning set of implicit preferences. And you would know this from looking at the simple, voting intention, or especially at the simple voting outcome, because you would think, okay, well, these people voted for this party, therefore they must be aligned with everything they say. And they don't. You would think that also by just looking at their explicit preferences. And this is where it can be really helpful for campaigns to have a more granular understanding of voters' preferences, because if you see someone has voted for the other party, you might just write them off and not bother canvassing them again next time. Whilst this measure is potentially suggests that some of these voters who were more aligned with the Republican Party were potentially also more conflicted about their decision. There are other explanations, but that is one of them. Here I show you all the measures and whether they were predictive of vote choice. And what it shows you, and the way I did this was by putting one single predictor predicting vote choice in a logistic regression. And you can see that child rearing values were actually very predictive of vote choice, as were all the explicit preferences, like the perception of the economy, how the president's job approval, and even the explicit preference index, but not the N for 100 effect, annoyingly. And this makes sense because the N for 100 effect wasn't telling us, wasn't aligning perfectly with explicit preferences. Therefore, it'll be limited in accounting for voting choice. However, in the conclusions I draw from these data and from this evidence, we can see that the N for 100, our implicit measure of political preference, reflected explicit preferences amongst our Democratic voters. It just didn't do it amongst Republican voters. And this is an interesting finding because the context in which those elections took place saw a lot more discontent, but also questioning on the Republican side than on the Democratic one, as it was in the wake of the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, of a woman's right to abortion, which had been enshrined in federal law for many years. And at the time that I conducted this study, polls indicated that around 30% of Republicans disagreed with this measure, and there were several issues that were splitting the Republican side more than the Democratic one. So it could be that the N for 100 was actually showing us nuances in individual political preferences that the explicit preferences weren't capturing. And this is where you can see the limitations of the traditional measures, because in this case, they were better at predicting voting behavior in our sample of 55 participants. But they weren't showing us how conflicted people were about those voting decisions. And the N for 100 gives us the flavor of that. And so this is why I say that ERPs might actually be reflecting implicit preferences, even if explicit preferences do weigh more in shaping the ultimate vote choices. But as a campaign, you want to know who is conflicted and who might be won over. And the N400 actually does give you indications in that regard. You might think that all of this is far-fetched and far away from the world of political campaigning. Nope. There are actually several neuroconsultancies that advise political campaigns on how to target voters, which voters to target, and especially how to approach them. These are just a few of those that I found in various articles on the internet, and it's not clear where they operate. But my guess would be probably the United States. So although it is a more expensive method than polling and other approaches to understanding voting behavior, elections, politics in the US, but also in other democracies, have essentially become an electoral arms race, which they shouldn't be. They should just be about voters valuing one option over the other and making their choice objective like that. But but as it is an electoral arms race, and the amount of money spent in the United States is obscene in terms of what they spend on political campaigning. So just something to bear in mind, that this is happening, and we should be aware of it, and of how other parties, especially parties that seek to overthrow our democratic norms, might be using them. And on that note, I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Any questions? I do have a question, but I'm going to let other folks ask first. No, over to you. Oh, you're muted, Noam, and then Charlie's just got a question after you.
Terribly sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much for the talk. I thought it was very, very interesting. I have just a couple of questions about the kind of, well, I guess one question really about the sort of the way the M400 works, and so your explanation at the beginning, there was a very sort of interesting and instructive thing about how like one of the features that this M400 response that's sort of noticeable is a deviation from expectations, right? So we have some kind of expectation of how a sentence should flow. When we get a word that doesn't fit or doesn't make sense or we don't agree with, that causes us to be to have an M400 response, right? But so it strikes me that one thing that could explain this phenomenon, right, is that it's capturing all the subtextual stuff that is actually going on deep. Another thing could be, so the Republicans say all the time, right? The Democrats overwhelmingly control the media. The mainline narrative is a kind of center-left leaning narrative. And actually, I think it would be fair to say, even though obviously I don't necessarily accept that that's true, that the kind of populist right in America, like a big part of how it built its movement is by being kind of unexpected, by being, anti the kind of traditional political lines. And you see kind of deviation from that. And so might it be that sort of right-wing talking points are, at the moment, because by design, by their own constructive design, more likely to trigger M400 responses in a way, and therefore the fact that both Republicans and Democrats deviating from that is not necessarily. You talked about it in terms of disagreement, and it might be a reflection of disagreement, or it might just be like, oh, that's kind of weird, and then the Republicans then sort of at a later thing think, oh, it's weird, but in a way that I kind of like. So my question is, is that, am I misunderstanding the M400, or is there like some degree of like debate about how we interpret what this response actually is at the end?
Thanks. Sorry, just to recap, just to reformulate your question, is your question that the Republican side might actually be throwing ideas and statements that are disorienting and surprising to their own voters?
Right, and intentionally as part of their like campaign strategy. That's my sort of hypothesis, is that might be something that's going on, not necessarily to try and produce an M400 response, but as part of their strategy to kind of drive engagement. I think that's something that's often.
Thanks, and you're definitely right that the N400 could pick up something which is incongruent because it's surprising. That could be the case. However, the Republicans weren't deviating from their usual script, so I actually derived most of the stimuli from the candidates' own social media and their own statements so that they would be recognizable as, pro-democratic or pro-republican. And the thing is that they were pretty much sticking to their historical scripts of, saying less taxes, smaller government, protecting the right to bear arms, and all the usual Republican, campaign points and policy preferences. So I don't think that would have been necessarily at work. That Republican participants would just have been disoriented by what the party statements and ideas were. But it might be that our particular sample of Republicans was a bit more liberal in their preferences, although and this was partially the case on two of the issues, on immigration and societal issues, but not on the economy. So it could be a specificity of our sample, but yeah, that is something to bear in mind, that if candidates were surprising and were throwing in ideas that voters feel are incongruent with that party's line, then you might be seeing some N400 responses which aren't picking up on disagreement with implicit values.
Thanks, and thank you, Emmanuel. Charlie, over to you.
Yes. Can you hear me? For a start?
Yes.
Yeah, good. That's the start. What I was going to ask was, this is clearly an area which is going to, I imagine, is going to develop and develop, because it sounds, like it's not quite early days, but it sounds like it's going to develop further. The question I wanted to ask was, obviously you gave examples of Remain Leave, and in US, Democrats v Republicans. And obviously, those are quite binary choice elections. So I wondered, bearing in mind we now face, for example, the UK, a 5-party, possibly now 6-party GB-wide system. And that's what I was asking about, it being sort of early stage. Do you think this will develop so that where there are almost what I would call multiple choices, effectively, that it will pick out the nuances of those potential multiple choices? So it sounds like it probably, this could develop further, but I just wonder what your current thinking on that is.
Thanks. So excellent question. And the answer is that it's a lot more difficult to pick up this measure if you don't have the binary choice, if there isn't a clear this party or that party. So you would have to split the statements between along different axes than just political affiliation. Instead of trying to predict how people would vote in the UK, and as you said, it'll be difficult because you have 5-6 potential outcomes. What you could do is, on issues like immigration, try to divide it along 2 axes and see how people along 2 dimensions, and see which side of those dimensions people fall on. But you're right, you wouldn't be able to do that on the basis of the party system. You would need structuring of the stimuli. So this was actually, Legali did another study in Italy where there is not a binary party system. And there the split she used was populist versus mainstream parties. So that's another way that you can do it.
Can I just follow up? Sorry, I know there's another question about it. It's a direct follow-up, so I think it just helps. And that was, obviously at constituency level, there could be quite well a lot of binary choice battles between, I don't know, Labour v Reform or Lib Dem v Tory or whatever, Google. So presumably that still works if you are going for a subset of constituencies where you might have simpler binary choices. And the other thought I had, and this is more for the political operatives who might be thinking, how can I do a Canada? How can I create a scenario where I generate my choice to win an election, which is basically what happened in Canada, to a certain degree in Australia as well. So, almost it's like, can it be used? It sounds like it can be used to test out statements, a series of statements. So if you were a political party seeking to develop much more of a binary choice outcome, which might suit, I don't know, a governing party, you can presumably do a lot of testing on those statements and use this sort of technology to do that. So that was, you didn't mind me coming back, but I just thought that was an immediately relevant question. I apologize to the other questioner.
No, but I just want to confirm, you're right. I mean, if you had, first of all, a binary, a de facto binary vote choice in specific constituencies, you could just use this approach. But also, it would be a good way to have a deeper understanding of what people's implicit preferences are on specific issues and specific statements beyond just which party they're going to vote for. But yeah, a great point.
Luke, over to you. Luca, sorry, over to you.
Hi, no worries for the name, don't worry. Hi, Emmanuel, thanks for the presentation. It was really, really inspiring. I'm working at the thesis at this moment about the role of affect in the student movement and student protests in Serbia. I'm not sure whether you're aware of the situation, but it's actually the movement that basically threatens to be the first globally visible movement that actually overthrew the regime, which was illiberal, which is kind of Trumpist, etc. And it's quite interesting case. So I started working about, because we had similar protests before, but none was this massive or had this kind of support. For 9 months straight, all of the universities are occupied in Serbia. We don't have higher education process at all at this point. So basically, I was interested in the affect studies and turned to affect as one of the explanations why it's different than anything before. And while you were talking in the beginning and talking about N400 and implicit reasons for decisions we make and the voters make, especially the part about 400 milliseconds reaction of our brain, it reminded me to Brian Massumi's theory and how he actually built the affect theory with that half second missing in some of the experiments before we verbalize certain things. So I was wondering if you're aware of that. Could you maybe relate this to political affect, or would you actually say that maybe affect is something unconscious or virtual, as he calls it, could be actually registered by measuring N400? Because it seems to me that it can. And you just messed up my whole point of my thesis, and now I need to consider this as well. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Gaj. Sorry, just to recap, you're saying what is the role of political affect in these implicit preferences, and then you had a question in relation to the pre-conscious aspect of the N400.
Exactly. So my point is that would you say that N400 could be used as some kind of indicator that there's something effective behind the conscience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's really a great point. It brings me back to the discussion of my PhD thesis, which is that so you know how there's this great neuroscientist called Damasio who formulated the idea that the body actually makes us lean one way or the other, that there's semantic markers that within a few seconds or milliseconds will make us prefer something compared to another. And this applies to any, object of cognition, that there's no such thing as, cold cognition. You're always leaning, liking or disliking something in some way. And I think although the N400 is usually associated with linguistic and semantic meaning, it doesn't mean that there is no, effective cognition taking place. And the way that I've approached N400 is that it is one of these semantic markers, one of these instances where we have an immediate liking or disliking component, so an effective component to how we appraise various, ideas and statements like the ones that I used. So I would definitely say that effective cognition is involved here. However, I would need to look back at the literature on the interplay with affect to get back to you in more detail. And on the other point, on the fact that it's pre-conscious. So, and this is actually one of the nice things about the N400, because within 400 milliseconds, this is before conscious appraisal takes place. And again, why is there that initial leaning towards one option rather than the other? I think it's because there is that semantic marker, that effective compass that directs us towards one option rather than the other. So I'm just trying. Could you please repeat the latter half of that question on the conscious versus unconscious dimension?
Basically, one of the things I'm looking into and that I'm interested in is about those unconscious of our decision-making process or voting preference eventually, because it seems to me that, and again, your answer was actually perfect because now I understand better what you're talking about. But the thing is that I'm trying to establish, does that unconscious you were talking about, implicit, is actually having a significant role in the decision?
Yeah.
It's like when I'm thinking about the framework you just provided, I understand the linguistic background of N400, but and semiotic. But on the other hand, it seems to me that the word itself might be like just a trigger for the effect.
Okay. Yeah. Although, yeah. So I would agree with part of that because it's true that it gives you indications of people's underlying cognitive process and of the way that they're effectively driven to follow. However, for example, my Republican participants, most of them, their implicit preferences weren't the best predictors of how they would vote, so of the actual behavior. And I know that there has been a lot of first excitement about the idea that it's actually unconscious, non-conscious factors that are driving most of behavior when Kahneman came out with thinking fast, thinking slow. But now actually a lot of researchers are revising that and saying that actually it's not, our decisions are also driven by conscious deliberation. So I just want to caveat that because ultimately the explicit reflective measures were better predictors of the actual behavior. And what the N400 shows you is how those decisions might be more conflicted and there might be more deliberation taking place. Don't know if that answers your question.
It does, again, making me reconsider my theoretical framework. It actually fits what you just said when you said that you have or examples you gave us about undecisive voters or Republican voters and how their N400 reacts, how you measured it. Basically, it again brings me back to effect because no one ever claimed that effect actually directs you into one or another direction. It can actually have both outcomes or several outcomes, and you never know which one it will be, or you can't predict that. So basically, yeah, I'm going to read your PhD to begin with, and then your research, and start thinking about this direction because I like it. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Okay, everyone. We've got time for one more final quick question. If no one's got a question, I'm going to try and sneak by one in, and then we'll finish off. I actually want to finish off a little bit early today, and we'll have a poll. Please fill the poll. My question is political tribalism. Your results, the difference between, or the notable difference that many Republicans don't seem to have a high N400 or be triggered, for lack of a better word, by Democratic statements they disagree with, whereas the inverse on the Democratic side is not the case. Democratic supporters do express strong disagreement, as the N400 sort of indicates, with Republican statements of disagreement. Could this be revealing of like basically this lack of disagreement by Republican supporters with what Democrats say? Could this be revealing of tribalism or the power of tribalism? Because like if they're not disagreeing with what the Democrats are saying, then why are they supporting Republicans, right? Might tribalism or something else be an explanation for that? I just want to know if there's any research that's been done in this area.
Thanks, Douglas, for that question. So I suppose what you mean by tribalism is how much do you adhere to the group norms of, you know,
That's
staying
right.
with the Republican Party, even if your individual implicit preference actually are deviating from that.
That's right. So it's more sort of identity-based rather than issues-based, like viewing these things as somewhat distinct.
Yeah, I mean, so you could say that. So of course, this is the outcome of polarization that many individuals on both sides will vote on the basis of their group identity rather than of their individual preferences. And this is actually what the child-rearing value of, you know, group-centric social values measures. And it's a possible explanation. You could say, well, you know, here were these Republicans who actually had lower alignment with their party compared to the Democrats, who still vote Republican, and that could be a group. How do you say? You had a term for it, a group signaling action rather than, you know, prioritizing your own individual preferences. However, I would also caveat that the Democrats also weren't perfectly aligned with their own party. Southern Texas is an interesting place because the Democrats are maybe a little bit more right-wing than in other parts of the country, and the Republicans are actually more aligned on their party on economy issues compared to the Democrats, who were, you know, less aligned with the Democratic Party. Also, it's difficult to say here because you know, we know that the Democrats had these, you know, implicit M400s that were showing us that they were aligned with their own party. But I'm thinking out loud because that is a possible. So my answer would be that's a possible explanation. I would look into it more because what the literature suggests is that tribalism is as much an attribute of the left in the United States than it is of the right. So that would be my caveat.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Emmanuel. I suppose now we're going to close off now because we're a bit pressed for time today.